We're ready.
Oh, did it pop up? I didn't see it. Okay, sorry.
That's okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to my session, Discover How Using Reading Research Can Help Reduce Inappropriate Referrals for Evaluation. My name is Lori Bean. I am with the Early Learning team in the Office of Special Education and Early Learning. I joined this team this year in January after spending 29 and a half years in my school district. My background is in kindergarten through third grade. I have been a classroom teacher. I have been a library media specialist. I have been a curriculum instruction assessment specialist, a reading interventionist, and a math interventionist. And sometimes I have been all of those at the same time. So I'm sure you all completely understand what I'm talking about. I'm very excited to share my information with you today. Before we get started, I want you to think about a couple of different situations. I want you to think about how you feel if you go to a new restaurant and you discover the best meal you have ever had. Or think about how you feel if you discover a new cleaning product and it is a miracle worker. Or think about how you feel if you discover a binge-worthy Netflix show with 5 seasons already released. Chances are, in each one of those situations, you are very excited about what you've discovered, and you can't wait to share your discovery with everyone you know. So that is how I feel about my journey in learning about this reading research. I am so excited to be able to share this information with you today. Now, I don't claim to be an expert in this area of reading research, but I am very passionate about what I've learned and excited to be here. So before we get started, let's look at our session goals. By participating in this session, you will gain an awareness of how applying this reading research can support better reading success for all students and potentially reduce inappropriate referrals for evaluation. You're going to have an awareness of my favorite part, how the brain learns to read. And you'll have an awareness of two models, the simple view of reading and how this model supports reading instruction and assessment. And you'll have an awareness of Scarborough's reading rope and how this demonstrates skills working together to enable reading to take place. So before we talk about this research, I want to talk a little bit about perspective. I want to model for you how perspective can change. Let's take a look at this story. We tried to get rid of the squirrel, but he loved it too much. Even though the squirrel was still around, the rabbit began to show up regularly. And the duck, with its incessant noise, seemed to always be about the house. Now, there are some things, a little piece of information missing for us to have full comprehension. But I live in the country on 10 acres, and this makes me think of when I see squirrels scampering up the tree in my yard, or when I see rabbits hopping around out in the yard by my garden, or when we don't have ducks, but sometimes geese overhead make lots and lots of noise as they fly by. But think about how this changes perspective when I show you the title. This is about the puppy's toys. So this gives you a different perspective. It gave you a little bit more insight. Things probably clicked in your brain a little bit better after you saw this title. It made more sense. Maybe you had an aha moment. So this is exactly what this reading research has done for me in my journey as an educator. Now, there'll be a couple of times in this session when I'm going to ask you to think about things from a different perspective. So before we talk about the actual research, let's take a look at why a different perspective is needed. Now, literacy in our country is a problem. It is a countrywide issue. In 2019, the NAEP scores revealed that only 35% of fourth graders and 34% of eighth graders in our country were considered to be proficient readers. Now, when you think about that proficiency spectrum, 35% and 34% proficient leaves so many of the students in our country on the other side of proficiency. Now, let's look at some data from our state. These K-Prep proficiency results from third grade reading show that barely half of our third grade students are scoring proficient or distinguished on the K-Prep assessments. Now, we won't even look at 2020, but look at what happened in 2021. Under 30% scored proficient. Now, this is not good. This data is not good, but there's really more to it than that. If we think about this data from a different perspective, thinking about that literacy is related to lifelong outcomes. Research shows us that literacy has an impact on economic well-being. It impacts health outcomes. It has an impact on social participation and civic engagement. Now, to me, this creates a sense of urgency for us to get reading instruction right so our children can be proficient readers. Marianne Wolf is a very well-known author and presenter in the world of reading research, and she once said this: literacy changes the brain, which actually we're going to talk about that in just a moment. Literacy literally changes the brain, which changes the individual, which changes society, which changes the future of our species. Now, it has been said that illiteracy is one of the most solvable issues of our time. I'm hoping that after this presentation, you will begin to have a little bit of hope about how we can begin to help our students become proficient readers. So let's look at the significance of third grade reading proficiency. Third grade is that pivotal year when we go from learning to read to reading to learn. Now think about if we barely have half of our third graders reading proficiently, what kind of content are they missing out on because perhaps they can't read it? So another significance of third grade is to think about this from a science perspective. The brain has the most plasticity from ages 3 years old to age 8 years old, and that's about the age of our third graders. So what this means is those circuits and the neural pathways in our brains that need to be created to be able to read are more easily created between the ages of 3 years old and 8 years old. So after age 8 or after third grade, it is still possible for students to learn to read, but it will require more time and more intervention. Also, students who are reading proficiently by third grade are more likely to have continued academic success. Now, we've all seen the information that students who begin behind tend to stay behind. But I'm going to say it doesn't have to be that way if we teach them how to read based on this reading research. Students who are reading proficiently by third grade are less likely to have problems with attendance, dropout rate, and juvenile crime. Thinking about literacy having lifelong outcomes. When I sat across the table from struggling readers, of course, I was working so hard to help them learn how to read. But I never thought about it from the perspective, if I'm not successful, this could have lifelong outcomes. It could affect their attendance. It could affect whether they graduate from high school or not. and it could affect their chances of becoming involved in juvenile crime. That creates a sense of urgency in me. Also, students who are reading proficiently by third grade are more likely to feel higher self-esteem and feelings of adequacy. In this day and age, more than ever, it is crucial for our students to feel like they have self-esteem and feelings of adequacy. And finally, students who are reading proficiently by third grade are more likely to break the cycle of intergenerational poverty. Poverty does not affect your ability to read, and students who learn to read can break that cycle of intergenerational poverty. It is possible. Now, another significance about third grade in particular, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, this year is the first year that our third grade students have had a normal school year since their school career began. So this makes it more important than ever to provide the skills that are needed for those students to close the achievement gap and to fill in those skills that may have become deficits by education during the pandemic. So clearly, something is not working. So what if we change the way we think about teaching reading? What if we look at how to teach children to read from the perspective of how a child's brain learns to read? That's where this reading research comes in. So this information in the hands of teachers can help them better understand the difference between a deficit in a foundational skill and a disability. So understanding the science, including how the brain learns to read, could have a big impact on our instruction. So before we talk more about the brain, I want us to talk about this research. This reading research that I'm talking about is not an ideology or a philosophy. It is not a fad, a trend, a new idea, or a pendulum swing. It is not a political agenda. It is not a one-size-fits-all approach. It is not a program of instruction, and it is not a single specific component of instruction, such as phonics. Now, this research that I'm talking about has been conducted over the past 5 decades, over thousands and thousands of studies in many different fields, including cognitive psychology, communication sciences, neuroscience, developmental psychology, and special education. It has taken place across the world in multiple languages. So this reading research that I'm talking about is a vast interdisciplinary body of scientifically based research about reading and issues related to reading and writing. So what is the result of this research? The result is that we have evidence to inform how proficient reading and writing develop, why some have difficulty, and how we can most effectively assess and teach and therefore improve student outcomes. Now, when I began to dive into this definition, the word evidence is what really stood out to me. We live in a world that demands evidence, evidence-based practices, evidence-based instruction. So this research provides us with evidence of how proficient reading and writing develop. It gives us evidence of why some students have difficulty learning to read. And it gives us evidence of how to most effectively assess and teach. So let's talk about this evidence. First of all, I need you to understand that learning to read is not natural for our brains. Our brains were not created to be able to read. So for us to be able to read, it takes several different parts of our brain working together. And those parts do not come already connected. Neural pathways and circuits have to be built through instruction. Think about if you want to learn how to play the violin, watching someone else play the violin is not going to help you learn how to play the violin. You need systematic, sequential, explicit instruction in order to develop that skill. Now, speaking, on the other hand, is hardwired in the human brain, so it doesn't have to be directly taught. So let's look at the speaking brain. These images show the activity in a brain when you speak a word. So you see the activity starts out in a small spot roughly in the middle of the left side of your brain, and that would be the brain showing on the left side of your screen. As you travel towards the right side of your screen, you can see that in less than a second, it spreads downward and forward until a big chunk of the left side of the brain is engaged. Now, I want you to notice the brain on the far right. The back part of that brain is dark because there is no activity. That part of the brain is not involved in speech at all. So now let's look at the same brain reading a word instead of speaking it. Now, it is important to note that both of these speaking brain and reading brain are on the left side of the brain. You can see on these bottom brain images on the very left of your screen, the little red image, that is where the activity starts at the back of the brain. This is the visual area. Now, if this were the brain of a non-reader, this first image is where the signal would end. There is nowhere for the signal to go because neural pathways have not been created. But since this is a reader, we see the activity follow along the bottom surface into the whole middle area of the brain. Now, I want you to look at the top brain and the bottom brain on the right side of your screen. And you can see the reading brain expands into that speaking brain area. That middle area that is responsible for speech is also engaged during reading. So everyone is born with the speech and language region part of their brain. And everyone is born with a visual part of the brain. But no one is born with connections between the vision and speech parts of the brain. And those are the connections that enable reading. So an interface or neural pathways have to be created between the spoken language system and the vision system. Those who struggle with reading are missing these strong connections. So what we teach and how we teach can actually either create and reinforce these brain connections, or it can leave students without the connections needed to be able to read for meaning. Now, I don't mean to oversimplify the process of reading. There are many other parts of the brain involved in reading. This is the beginning of the reading. So these are the two areas that we're going to focus on today. The beginning of the reading circuit is the spoken word. So the speech sounds have to be mapped to print, so students eventually recognize words instantly and effortlessly. So those speech sounds from the speaking brain have to be mapped to the vision system in the vision part of our brain for reading to take place. It's important for educators to understand that reading is a language-based skill. It is not a visual memory skill. So practices in education that emphasize visual memory or learning words as a whole or guessing at words do not create these neural pathways that are necessary for proficient reading. Bruce McCandless has done research at the Stanford University, and this research has shown some fascinating results. So what he did is using a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, an fMRI machine. They would use a cap with 128 electrodes on the cap, and that cap could take 1,000 images per second, almost like stop motion photography. So they put this cap on these children and put them in the fMRI machine, and the children received instruction. And this is the question they were trying to answer. Did the way the educator focused attention change the rewiring in the brain? So the results show that beginning readers who focus on letter-sound relationships, phonics, instead of trying to learn the word as a whole, increased activity in the area of the brain best wired for reading. So words learned using letter sounds activate that left side of the brain. And this is where the visual and language regions are located. So words learned as a whole word method activate the right side of the brain. So why is this important? This is important to know because left brain activation during reading is a characteristic of skilled readers. This activity is generally lacking in struggling readers. So if a student is struggling to read, could it be from a deficit in the building of the reading part of the left brain and not necessarily a disability? So we've talked about the importance of building connections between the vision and language regions of the brain. But at the same time, children need to be building their bank of word meanings and their understanding of language at all levels. I talked about how speaking is hardwired in the brain. That doesn't mean students don't need instruction to build background knowledge and build that vocabulary. It is the interaction of these two systems that support students to understand what they read. And that brings us to the simple view of reading. In 1986, two researchers, Goff and Tunmer, proposed a model of how children learn to read called the simple view of reading. Now, this model represents bringing together that sound symbol circuit in our brains, which is the blue decoding box, and the word meaning circuits in our brains, which is the red language comprehension box, to produce the ability to understand text, which is the purple reading comprehension box. Now, I want you to notice this is a multiplication problem, and we'll talk more about that in just a bit. The blue decoding box would involve things such as phonological awareness, phonics, the alphabetic principle, which is recognizing alphabetic symbols that correspond with speech sounds. It involves sight recognition of familiar words. And it's important to know when you're looking at students who are struggling with reading comprehension, there is no comprehension strategy powerful enough to compensate for the fact that you cannot read the words. Decoding is absolutely necessary, but it is not sufficient for reading comprehension. And that's where the language comprehension comes in. Sometimes this is called listening comprehension. Now, this involves things such as background knowledge, vocabulary, syntax, which would be word order, semantics, which would deal with word meanings, and print concepts. Now, my preschool directors, this is a big part of our world. building that oral language that builds background knowledge and vocabulary, and knowing that this is supporting reading comprehension. This summer, I was fortunate enough to get to present at the Early Childhood Institute, and my whole presentation was on just this part of the simple view of reading, and talking about how oral language is an essential component for comprehension, and how reading comprehension can actually begin at birth. We need to educate our parents about the importance of talking to children from the moment they're born on, and how the importance of effectively back and forth language interactions with babies from day one is beginning to prepare them for reading comprehension. We talked about how reading comprehension cannot exceed language or listening comprehension. If you can't listen to a story and talk about it or discuss what happened in the story, then you can't read a story at that level and comprehend it. So supporting students in becoming successful readers actually requires careful attention to both sides of this reading comprehension equation. So I'd like for us to look at each side of this a little more closely. Let's look at the decoding side. I want to see if anybody would volunteer to read this story for us. So I'm guessing I have no volunteers. I am not able to read this. You are not able to read this because there are no speech sounds in our brains that are mapped to these symbols that we see on the screen. So we cannot decode these words. Therefore, it is going to affect our ability to be able to comprehend. Now, I also want to mention at this part, when I was a curriculum instruction assessment specialist, I would talk to my kindergarten teachers about thinking about our alphabetic system looks like this to our beginning readers. It looks foreign to them, just as this looks foreign to us, and we're proficient readers. So thinking about the feeling that it gives students of any age when they're asked to read, and our alphabetic system is this foreign to those kids, they're not going to get to reading comprehension. And so that you know, this is actually from a very popular children's book by Eric Carle, The Very Hungry Caterpillar. So then let's look at the other side of that reading comprehension equation. England's openers labored 34 balls before scoring their first boundary as Strauss cracked 2 fours through the leg side. Cook made a patient start before motoring past his skipper. Now, I think I read that fluently. I was accurate, and I even read with expression. But I cannot tell you about anything that I just read. So when teachers listen to students read and they sound like good readers, but they can't answer comprehension questions, think about if it is from a lack of background knowledge and vocabulary. I am not able to comprehend this passage because my background knowledge and vocabulary about the game of cricket do not support my comprehension. So I want us to look at a couple of different situations involving this simple view of reading. I'm going to assign a value of 0 if a student is not proficient in that skill. And I'm going to assign a value of 1 to show proficiency. So let's look at how this multiplication equation works. So first of all, if a student cannot decode, so they get a value of 0, but they do have grade level listening or language comprehension, they still won't understand what they read because 0 times 1 equals 0. Now, this would be typical of students with dyslexia. Dyslexia is a phonological auditory issue, not a visual issue. So in looking at this kind of situation, if you're looking at data of struggling readers, here are some questions that you can ask. Is it a decoding issue? Is the student phonemically aware? Does the student know patterns in language? What does a spelling inventory show, or what does a phonics inventory show? And I want to talk just a second about the importance of spelling inventories. Spelling inventories give us lots of insight into how students are processing sounds. So many times when students are making mistakes in their spelling, it is a sound confusion and not a letter confusion. So spelling inventories can give us insight into how they are processing those sounds. So let's look at another situation. If a student can decode, so they get a 1 for the blue box, but they do not have grade level language comprehension, they still won't understand what they read because 1 times 0 still equals 0. Now, this is typical of our English language learners. Many times they can fairly quickly pick up the code of reading, but their background knowledge and their vocabulary are not going to support them in being able to comprehend what they read. This is also typical of our students with hyperlexia. So struggles in this area are a little bit harder to pinpoint. So this would be where our speech and language pathologist would be a great resource for our teachers. Some questions to think about if you have an idea students may be struggling in this area. Can the student speak in complete sentences? Can the child answer questions in detail? Can the child join in conversations with the whole class around the material being discussed? Now, sometimes the issue can be both skills. So I'm going 0.75 is very, very close to 1. So that may be good or adequate skills. So you can see how reading comprehension is still diminished to barely half. So even if they almost have both skills, comprehension is still diminished. So I want to talk just a moment about our compensators. They can have adequate to good decoding skills. They usually have strong language comprehension skills, but there is an undetected weakness in one or more of the basic skills needed for reading comprehension, such as phonemic awareness. So as a result, their reading comprehension skills are unable to match their language comprehension skills. So they may be able to score almost average or a little below average. So sometimes they go undetected. They may be really good at guessing words. Therefore, they're the compensators. Now, there are times that these students have to work because of a lack of phonemic awareness, foundational skills. They may have to work very, very hard to be able to read each word, and it is exhausting. And reading is hard, and therefore they try to avoid that work, which can sometimes lead to behaviors in an attempt to avoid the work. So these two skill areas, decoding and language comprehension, are considered essential and can inform what skills we teach and how we teach them. The simple view of reading can serve as a framework for what we teach, what we assess, and how we determine where a student is struggling if they aren't comprehending. So I want you to think about, can this model support teachers as they begin to think about the difference between a deficit in foundational skills and a disability? So another conceptual model I would like for us to look at is from Dr. Hollis Scarborough. This demonstrates the same principle. Although these pieces of research, the simple view of reading and Scarborough's reading rope, were done independent of one another. Scarborough's reading rope has the same components as the simple view of reading. You can see the blue word recognition box and the red language comprehension box and the purple reading comprehension box. So I want you to notice on the left side of the screen, all of these strands start off as individual skills. But to get to reading comprehension, they must combine with the others. Dr. Hollis Scarborough used to do this presentation, and to model this reading rope, she would use pipe cleaners twisted together to show skills working together to create reading comprehension. Sharon Vaughn at the Meadows Center at the University of Texas talked about Scarborough's reading rope, and she talked about how word recognition is knowledge of the word. This part of the rope involves a finite task that needs to be developed by that crucial year, third grade, through explicit instruction. And that language comprehension is knowledge of the world. And this develops over an entire lifespan. My vocabulary and background knowledge about reading has greatly increased since I've been learning about this research. So I want you to think about in 2000, the National Reading Panel came up with the pillars of reading instruction. They talked about phonics and phonemic awareness and vocabulary and comprehension. And you will find all of those areas in the simple view of reading and in Scarborough's reading rope. The fifth area the National Reading Panel talked about was fluency. Now, you will notice that fluency is not a part of either one of these models because fluency in and of itself is not a skill. You have to be fluent at a task, and that task needs to be word recognition. So you see down at the bottom, the increasingly automatic word recognition strand represents the fluency. So if a word does not become automatic, then language comprehension cannot become more strategic. So this too can serve as a framework for what we teach, what we assess, and how we determine where a student is struggling if they aren't comprehending. Dave Kilpatrick is another well-known author and presenter in this reading research world. In his popular book, Equipped for Reading Success, he says this: rather than labeling students reading disabled, learning disabled, or dyslexic, it makes more sense to look at what determines skilled reading and find out which skill areas are holding students back. He says it makes more sense to evaluate key areas and address any weaknesses directly rather than considering a child disabled. Now, one resource I would like to talk about is the PAST Screener. You can find this on the web free, thepasttest.com. Now, I want to caution, it is very important that you understand the directions for this phonological awareness assessment and that you complete it with fidelity. And it is suggested that you practice this on students who are not struggling readers before you can complete it on students who are struggling to read. So I think the simple view of reading and Scarborough's reading rope provide us with a good place to start seeing what skilled reading looks like. So going back to the beginning of how our brain learns to read, reading is a language-based skill. So the first skills to emphasize in instruction are phonemic awareness and oral language. I'd like to share with you some things that I read, and these things are actually what led me to be so passionate about this reading research. Students with strong phonological awareness are likely to become good readers, but students with weak phonological awareness skills will likely become poor readers. It is estimated that the vast majority, more than 90% of students with significant reading problems, have a core deficit in their ability to process phonological information. And phonemic awareness performance can predict literacy performance more accurately than variables such as intelligence, vocabulary knowledge, and socioeconomic status. So again, I ask, where do we start? Well, I'm going to suggest that we start by thinking about the theme of our conference. We start by going back to the basics. Teachers need to know the difference in phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, and phonics. They need to know that to develop phonological awareness, kindergarten and first grade students must demonstrate understanding of spoken words and syllables and phonemes. They need to understand that phonemic awareness is being aware of the individual phonemes in words and the ability to manipulate those phonemes. So that leads us to, what is a phoneme? Teachers need to understand that a phoneme is a speech sound and that there are actually 44 of them. Now, while we're talking about sounds, I'm going to have to step up on my soapbox for just a moment. It is crucial that our teachers are making letter sounds correctly and not putting that sound at the end of the word, like ka, ta. If I'm trying to lead a student to be a reader and I'm trying to help them blend a word and I say ka, ta, that sounds nothing like the word I'm leading them to. But if I say k, at, they can more easily hear the word cat. So it's crucial that they understand how to pronounce the sounds correctly and they understand which sounds have voice box on and which sounds have voice box off. They need to know articulatory gestures and how that supports students as they learn to make sounds correctly. Teachers need to understand all levels of phoneme awareness. As an entry point, we start out with phoneme identification and isolation. Two best predictors of early reading success are letter naming and initial sound isolation, which is a phonemic awareness skill. Then from there, you move into phoneme segmenting, which will facilitate encoding or spelling, and phoneme blending, which will facilitate decoding. Now, many times we think about phonemic awareness being an early kindergarten or first grade skill, but it needs to continue into second grade or further if needed. They need to move into phoneme substitution, phoneme addition, and phoneme deletion because manipulating phonemes facilitates that decoding needed for instant sight word recognition. Teachers need to understand the alphabetic principle, the concept that letters are used to represent individual phonemes in the word, because insight into this principle is critical for learning to read and spell. It builds the foundation for phonics instruction. And knowing that phoneme awareness plays a central role in building a sight word vocabulary. Knowing that we do not store words based on visual memory. Teachers need to understand orthographic mapping. That is the mental process we use to permanently store words for immediate, effortless retrieval. And phoneme awareness is one of the most important skills needed for orthographic mapping to take place. So, a while back, when I began to think about how I was going to develop this session, I started thinking about this Lego structure that my dad put together. Now, this Lego structure is quite elaborate. It is of the Lambeau Field, the football stadium of the Green Bay Packers. So it made me start thinking about how reading instruction is like Legos. The foundation of my dad's Lego structure was important for the end result to be what he intended it to be. If he didn't get that foundation right, everything he built upon it wouldn't function as he intended. The end result wouldn't be correct. So, reading is the same way. If the foundation isn't built correctly, the end result, which is comprehension, will be affected. Also, another way to think about this, when my dad put together this structure, when he got finished, if it didn't look like it was supposed to look, it didn't look like what he expected, it did not mean that the Legos didn't work sufficiently. It meant there was a piece missing somewhere in that structure. And once that piece was in place, it provided a solid foundation needed to get the expected result. It's just the same in reading. If comprehension is not there, we may need to go back and add that missing piece to the foundation before we consider it a disability. So I would like to close with this quote from Maya Angelou. It's how I feel about my journey as an educator. When I was in the classroom, I, like all teachers out there working so hard, I was doing the best that I knew. It may not have always been right, but I worked hard and it was the best that I knew. But as my journey in education continues, and as I continue to learn, as I know better, I will be able to do better. So here is my contact information. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I do not promise that I have all the answers, but I do promise that I will research and study and work until I find the answers that you are looking for. Thank you so much for attending my session today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.